Hey everybody, sorry I'm late getting this up. Like I said, I had some technical difficulties. Regardless, here we go with a discussion about presidential amendments. You guys know that an amendment is something that changes the Constitution. It's some kind of alteration of something having to do with a very specific thing in the Constitution, or it's adding something to the Constitution itself. So we're going to look at the ones that affect the President of the United States. First one we're looking at is the 12th Amendment. The 12th Amendment modifies the Electoral College. What it does is replaces Article 2, Section 1, Clause 3, which outlines the original way that the Electoral College selected the president and vice president. You see, originally, every member of the Electoral College got 2 votes, and both of those votes were President of the United States. So if you were a member of the Electoral College, you would pick your 2 favorite people running for president to be president. Whoever got the most votes would be president. Whoever got the second most votes would be vice president. So this worked fine so long as George Washington was running for president. So when Washington was running for president, everybody used one of their votes for George Washington, and then the other vote they spread amongst everyone else. Then Washington stepped away after 2 terms, and it was a very close election in 1796 between Jefferson and Adams, where Adams won, making Jefferson second place vice president. But they were different political parties. Then, 4 years later, it got even more complicated. In the year 1800, there was a tie in electoral votes between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. And then that meant it was going to go to the House of Representatives. And then it was a tie again and again and again. Over 30 votes in the House until finally somebody switched a vote to Jefferson, making him president and Aaron Burr vice president. The 12th Amendment is an attempt to prevent something like that from ever happening again. It technically still could, but it's less likely now. So now every elector gets 2 votes still, but one's for president, the other is for vice president. It also clears up that the vice president must meet the same qualifications as the president of the United States. Natural-born U.S. citizen, lived in the U.S. for at least 14 years, and at least 35 years old. So this one has to do with voting. I've included voting rights in this, as many of them have to do with who gets a say in who the president is. The 15th Amendment was passed in the wake of the Civil War during Reconstruction. And what it does is prohibits discrimination at the voting booth based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Basically saying if you are a former slave, you can't be denied the right to vote because of it. However, many state and local governments made it so that they came up with new ways to discriminate against people at the voting booth that weren't technically race or color, previous condition of servitude. Things like literacy tests, things like poll taxes, things like exemptions if you could prove that you're the descendant of somebody who used to be eligible to vote pre-Civil War, as in not anybody who is a former slave. The 19th Amendment also has to do with voting rights. This was the amendment that guarantees equal voting rights on the basis of sex. You cannot be denied the right to vote based on your gender. The 20th Amendment. This one's interesting because it applies literally to today, which is the day I'm recording it, January 20th, the day that Joseph Biden will be inaugurated as the 46th President of the United States. The president used to be inaugurated on March 4th. This was done so that there was plenty of time to get the president-elect's affairs in order to become president and to get the affairs of the current president in order to leave office. It was reduced when it was decided we don't need that much time anymore. So it was moved to January 20th. It also says what would happen if the president-elect dies or becomes disqualified before becoming president. And basically, it's what everyone would assume would happen, but now it's in the Constitution. The vice president elect would become the president elect if that were to happen. The 22nd Amendment, this has to do with the limiting of presidential terms. Franklin Roosevelt, he got elected to a third term in 1940, which was unprecedented. No president had ever achieved a third term of office. And then in 1944, he got elected a fourth time. Now, he died shortly into that fourth term, but he is the only president and will be the only president to have been elected 4 times. Here's a mnemonic device for it. This limits a president to 2 terms. So you can take that 2 terms and make it the 22nd Amendment, 2-2. Additionally, it says that if a vice president takes over for a president and it's less than half of a term, well, then they are still eligible to 2 full terms. So technically, somebody could serve nearly 10 years as president, even with the passage of the 22nd Amendment. 23rd Amendment. This is giving electoral votes for Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., up until the 1960s, did not have a say in who was president of the United States. They had no electoral votes. They now have, according to the 23rd Amendment, the same number of electors as the least populous state, which is currently Wyoming. Right now, Washington, D.C. has a larger population than Wyoming and larger than Vermont. If Washington, D.C. becomes a state, then they would have, as prescribed by the Constitution, 4 states, 2 senators, and 1 member of the House of Representatives with voting rights. The D.C. member of the House currently is not able to vote. 24th Amendment eliminates poll taxes. If you remember, I mentioned poll taxes a couple minutes ago with the 15th Amendment, how they were still able to prevent African Americans from being able to vote, basically by saying you had to pay in order to vote. It was a way to prevent poor people from being able to vote. The 24th Amendment eliminates any sort of payment of a tax of any kind in order to vote for any sort of federal office. The literacy tests are also banned on a federal level, but that's by federal law, not by a constitutional amendment. The 25th Amendment you probably had heard about in the past 2 weeks since the events of January 6th. But there's a number of provisions in the 25th Amendment. One, it clears up the line of succession. It wasn't very specific in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 6 for what happens if the president isn't president anymore. It said that the duty shall fall to the vice president. And there were arguments as to whether that means, are you the new president or are you acting president? John Tyler, the first person who had to take over for a president who had died, stated, I am the president. And there was debate about this. This is finally cleared up in the 1960s. Additionally, what are we going to do if there is no vice president? There were 8 times in American history in which there was no vice president because the vice president became president. 4 times due to assassination. What it means is, or what it states is that the president gets to appoint a new vice president that must be confirmed by both houses of Congress. This amendment was ratified in 1967 and was used twice and has only been used twice in the early 1970s. When Richard Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, resigned amid scandal, he appointed Gerald Ford to be his new vice president. And then when Nixon resigned amid scandal and Gerald Ford became president, President Ford appointed Nelson Rockefeller to be his vice president. Additionally, the president is able to declare himself unable to fulfill his duties. This has happened on a temporary basis a small handful of times. President Reagan had to go under anesthesia for a medical procedure, so he temporarily gave the powers of the presidency to Vice President H.W. Bush, and then President W. Bush had to go under anesthesia for routine medical procedures, and he temporarily gave the powers of the presidency to Vice President Cheney. And then, once he was out of anesthesia, in all instances, they resumed the powers of the presidency. What you would have been hearing about in the past 2 weeks is Section 4. Can the president be removed? The vice president and half of the cabinet, or another body as created by the legislature, can vote that the president can no longer fulfill his duties. The president then this can only last for 4 days, the way it's stated. And the president can send a letter to Congress stating that he is, in fact, able to fulfill his duties. And then there's a process from that point. There was a lot of discussion after the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th as to whether or not the 25th Amendment would be invoked. But the key to it is the vice president has to be on board. It can't just be a majority of the cabinet. And Vice President Pence made it clear that he was not going to vote or invoke the 25th Amendment. The final amendment we're going to address, again, has to do with the right to vote, and that has to do with age. The 26th Amendment, which was passed with very large support and in a very quick manner. You can see it was less than 4 months from the time it was proposed to the time it was ratified, reduced the age to vote to 18 years old. This took place because it was during the Vietnam era in which young men ages 18 to 20 were being drafted against their will and sent to Vietnam to fight for the United States and being wounded or even dying without the right to vote for the members of Congress that sent them there. So this happened quickly. This is why even if your birthday is election day and you turn 18 that day, you're still able to vote. No state can set it any higher than your 18th birthday. All right, that's what I got for you guys. Make sure you do your check. Make sure you get everything you can turned in before Monday, January 25th at midnight if you want any credit for any of it for the first semester. All right, happy Inauguration Day. Good luck. Bye.